What's better than playing some obscure old games? If you answered, playing them really fast, then you'd be correct because that's exactly what we're looking to do here today. The idea is simple. I want to play a lesser known game that I've never played before, hopefully enjoy it, and then I'm going to try my hardest to see if I can get the speedrunning world record for it, all while providing some thoughts on the game, of course. But first, I need to figure out what I'm actually going to play. And for that, I have some basic criteria lined up for the type of game I think might be suitable for this type of challenge. First, it needs to be a game that has some competition to it, even if it's only a few other runners. I'm not interested in trying to stake my claim in a dead category. I need other people who can feel that sting of defeat. Second, it needs to have not too much competition, as I'm not too interested in feeling that sense of defeat myself. And finally, it can't be too long of a run. My soft cap is around 2.5 hours, though I'd really prefer it to be under 2 hours or less. Ultimately, it needs to be a game where nabbing the world record could reasonably be accomplished, and preferably within maybe 1 or 2 dozen attempts. I mean, not only do I need to play this game casually, learn it, and then run it, but then I need to make a whole video about it as well. Thankfully, this criteria all lends itself very well to the type of game I already gravitate towards, that being obscure 5th generation games. I took a look through my personal backlog to see if I could find a title that might be a good candidate, while also looking through the leaderboards on speedrun.com, and almost immediately it seemed like I had found what I was looking for. It's Dr. Slump, the 1999 Japan-only PlayStation release from Bandai. Now, for those of you that are more anime inclined, or for those who at least saw that one episode of Dragon Ball Super, you may recognize this as one of the late great Akira Toriyama's other series, his first major hit before creating Dragon Ball. The Dr. Slump franchise has many forms and adaptations, such as the original manga series, an anime adaptation from the 80s with over 200 episodes titled Dr. Slump Arale-chan, and various movies, but this PlayStation release is specifically based off of the 1997 anime remake series just titled Dr. Slump. Although the game is a Japanese exclusive, it did receive a fan translation a few years back thanks to the excellent work of translator HilltopWorks, who I feel really deserves some recognition here. Seriously, I wasn't familiar with their game, but they've put in some real work in translating some lesser-known bangers that were on my own personal list of games to play, including Square's racing RPG Racing Lagoon and the PlayStation adventure game Aconcagua, which I'm not totally sure I'm pronouncing right and is a bit of a mouthful. I don't know this translator personally or anything, but I've included a link to their Patreon in the video description for anyone that might want to show some support or just check out some of their other work. Anyway, for speedrunning, Dr. Slump seemed like it could be a perfect fit here. The game's current any % world record stands at a solid 1 hour and 47 minutes, being held by runner Kefka14, with the runner-up landing at a solid... Oh, well, I guess that's it then. Good enough for me. Now you might be asking, why is this a challenge and why are you doing this? Well, there's a few reasons. For one thing, because this will be a legitimate challenge. I'm not personally much of a speedrunner, though I do have one paltry world record for a mostly uncompetitive game, and when it comes to competitive gaming, I typically fall into the pretty good but not outstanding category of skill. Another reason to do this is I want to see what this actually looks like. How hard is it to get the world record from total scratch for an obscure game? Is it even possible without some significant practice and time investment? And finally, well, it just sounds fun. I'll really get to maximize my time spent with whatever game and maybe discover some new layers of enjoyment I wouldn't have found from having only done a casual playthrough. But before I could make any sort of attempt at speedrunning, I first wanted to be able to enjoy a casual playthrough of the game where I could take things slow and really enjoy my time with the game. To be honest, I didn't really know much of anything about this game, or even the Dr. Slump franchise in general, beyond that I thought the visuals looked incredible from what I'd already seen. I mean, seriously, I think these Mega Man Legends style graphics single-handedly landed this game on my to-play list, and I really didn't even know what the gameplay looked like. So, I booted up the game to give it a try. The best way that I can describe Dr. Slump as a game is, imagine that you're playing through 7 episodes of a comedy anime. And that's it. This is not a licensed anime game that has some forced gameplay loop with light theming wrapped around it. No, this is a game that really seems to try and capture the heart of what the Dr. Slump series is all about. Unfortunately, however, that doesn't always make for the most engaging gameplay. You see, the general flow of this game has you running around the town of Penguin Village, talking to friends and villagers, delivering items back and forth, and completing what feel like side quests, all while your main character, Arale, takes the piss out of folks and deals with some pretty ridiculous situations. Surface level, that all sounds pretty great until you realize this game is really a lot of running around town and talking to people, which means the experience really hinges on the strength of the comedy and the dialogue. And for that, it might be a little hit or miss, though I'd mostly give it all a solid thumbs up, with plenty of tongue-in-cheek humor and a few particularly outlandish bits that made me audibly laugh. For example, there's this character named Superman with the hiragana for the su sound written on his chest who, while trying to present himself as a hero, is depicted as a bit of a loser that the town sort of just puts up with and is the butt of a lot of jokes. At one point, another villager, another child robot named Obachaman, realizes he needs a place to live in and, after mistaking Superman's house as being uninhabited, straight up picks up the house and takes it to be his own, commenting, "I can't believe anyone will leave a perfectly good house just laying around like this." I also had a good laugh when it was revealed that Superman's non-superhero name was Clark Kenta for just how ridiculously on the nose it was. There are all sorts of ridiculous gags, bits, and side characters to be found all throughout. Like for instance, you have these aliens that I really liked who sort of look like a cross between Dr. Mario viruses and the Moonanites who frequently end up in ridiculous situations as they try to figure out how to acquire a spaceship to return home. There's a teacher with an inflated ego and an outrageously large head, an imp that seems determined to literally kill people, an arch-nemesis scientist who naturally fails in all of his schemes, and well, the list goes on, but my point is you'll meet a pretty diverse and colorful cast of characters. From a little bit of Googling, it seems like most of these characters aren't exclusive to the game, which means that for any existing Dr. Slump fans, you'll likely get a kick out of seeing your favorite characters throughout the game. And for the rest of us going in blind, these characters feel novel and fresh, which makes it a real win-win in my opinion. But then there are some gags that are just a little too 90s anime for my liking. Things like farting abilities and gags involving nudie magazines, it's a lot of old school anime humor that you're likely already familiar with. And I realize that this is all probably just a me thing. My tolerance for this style of humor isn't super high these days, but I think it's worth noting that it may not be for everybody. Outside of running around and talking to folks, you'll also have your action stages that cap off most of the game's 7 chapters. These are more traditional and what you'd probably expect from a late 90s 3D platformer. They're pretty brief, with most able to be completed in under 10 minutes casually, but provide what I feel is the actual meat of the gameplay. It has all the elements you might expect: jumping across platforms, running through areas, fighting enemies, collecting various items, and so on and so forth. I think it's all totally competent. It's nothing revolutionary, but it's fun enough and helps with the game's overall sluggish pacing. One aspect of note is that the game is lacking any sort of manual camera control, which, while this isn't too unusual for this era, it can result in some areas becoming surprisingly frustrating due to some ambiguous depth perception and some kind of unintuitive aerial momentum for Arale. This wouldn't be as much of an issue if the game wasn't filled with instant death pitfalls, which are strangely unforgiving for this type of game. However, for all the completionists out there, there are these golden poos for you to collect throughout each stage, which help extend the game's runtime and also provide some nice replay incentive. Throughout the game, your protagonist Arale will be picking up new abilities she learns from other characters via her capture ability, which, considering that she's a robot, I assume is meant to be a nod to the Mega Man games. From some googling around about the rest of the franchise, this also didn't seem to be an attribute she had in the manga or shows, which further makes me feel that this was meant as a tongue-in-cheek reference. This capture ability will be how Arale learns basically every ability she has for use during the action stages, and to my knowledge, you can't ever really miss any of them. They're pretty much required for progressing. I'll also say that for how simple it really is, her colorful capture celebration may have been one of my favorite parts of the entire game and had me light up a bit every time it happened. My casual run of the game took maybe 6 or 7 hours. I really wasn't keeping great track of time, but it went by at a good enough pace. I'll have plenty more thoughts to provide on my time with the game as we move forward here, but for now, I think it's time we dip our toes into the fast-paced world of speedrunning. At this point, I was starting to realize just how much I didn't actually know regarding this run. I'd selected this game off of some pretty arbitrary criteria, and while it only having one runner felt like a serious advantage at first, I soon realized how binary of an accomplishment this could be. As Ricky Bobby would say,
"If you ain't first, you're last."
I also didn't actually have any idea just how optimized this run from Kefka actually was. I mean, don't get me wrong, I feel I'm one to rise to the occasion, and as mentioned before, I'm not a complete speedrunning novice. But just because Kefka was the only runner of the game, that didn't necessarily mean they'd be easy to beat. They'd already cut their time down by a full 17 minutes, and taking a look at their speedrun.com profile, they had nearly 1,400 runs submitted across various games. They weren't fucking around. However, I decided I needed to push these anxieties aside for the time being, and focused on starting my first run to set myself a solid starting point. My expectations were low for this maiden speedrunning voyage. For this first run, I really just wanted to get an idea of what it would feel like to run the game and set myself some sort of personal performance benchmark. While my speedrunning experience was relatively limited, I did know that there was a world of difference between theory and execution when running these games. Important details need to be recalled quickly, and oftentimes, split-second decisions will have to be made, especially when trying to correct for unexpected errors. My main goal for this run was to get a feel for these sort of things, document what sort of pitfalls to look out for, and make a mental note of any particular areas that could use improvement. That meant no practice for this run. I'd be doing it raw. However, I did have available to me a general guide and flowchart for how to route the game, which was made available thanks to some fine folks, including Kefka, who had played and documented their best known routes for progressing through the game. And these folks definitely deserve a shout out here because this guide was super useful and personally saved me many hours of having to trial and error all of this myself. Due to the nature of the game being pretty heavy on loading screens, I also would have plenty of time to consult this guide on a second monitor as I played. Now, one thing about running this game as a speed game versus playing casually is that some concessions have to be made on the technical side, or at least I felt they needed to be in the interest of fairness. You see, something I've failed to mention up to this point is that when playing with default settings, meaning using base console clock speeds, this game has quite a bit of performance issues. The frame rate frequently drops to visibly low levels, particularly when Raleigh is using her dash or if there's just a lot being rendered on the screen at once. During a casual run, a lot of this can be mitigated by increasing the clock speed by 20 or 30% in your emulator, making the game look and feel much smoother. But when playing the game as a speed game, it felt like changing these settings might ruin the competitive integrity of the run. I wasn't 100% sure if the frame rate difference actually affected the game speed, since I figured it is possible that the internal logic could run at a consistent frame rate while the displayed and rendered frames could independently slow down, but even if it did only affect the visual presentation, that still felt like some level of advantage to me. Additionally, the rules for the category, while explicitly allowing for emulated runs, didn't seem to mention anything regarding clock speed. So, erring on the side of caution, I begrudgingly set the console clock speed back to its base level and just put up with the frequent frame drops. And I won't lie, it was a bit of a painful experience, and for any of you who might give this game a try casually, I would definitely suggest upping that clock speed a bit for a smoother performance. Anyway, this first run attempt was mostly uneventful, but did help set the groundwork for feeling out how to run the game. My final time ended up being 2 hours, 7 minutes, and 47 seconds, which was around 20.5 minutes slower than the world record. Considering I had a guide to route me through most of the interactions around town, the biggest pain points definitely ended up being the action stages. I had many deaths during some of these, which was partly due to pure stubbornness. For instance, during the frigid action stage 5, I died many times attempting to do this long jump skip that I hadn't actually practiced, which cost me a decent chunk of time. But in general, this run had overall poor routing and strategy for these action stages, and I knew they'd be the main aspect I'd need to practice if I wanted to nab the world record. But before we analyze this run any further, I need to address something very important I learned from this first run attempt, and something I would have already known had I done even a bit of research beforehand, and that is, maybe this wasn't actually the best choice of speed game. See, my game selection criteria was pretty good for making sure I could realistically have a chance at beating a world record, but what it didn't account for was how fun the game is to actually run. I don't mean this as an indictment of the game as a whole, but when 80% of your run consists of mashing through dialogue and running through areas of the town in a very specific order, there isn't a ton of room left over for actual player agency. And in terms of fun, the biggest hook of the game during a casual playthrough is I feel its comedy and dialogue, which not only runs a bit thin on replay, but also, your whole mission statement here is to blitz through that dialogue as fast as humanly possible. With even a little bit of practice, I think most people would be able to accomplish near optimal times for around 3/4 of the run, with two big exceptions. The first is obviously the action stages, which, while not being terribly difficult, do provide more opportunity for skill expression, time saves, and split-second decision making, like weighing the risk-reward for the use of different strategies. The second, and far more sinister exception, is one that I hate with a passion, and I may not have chosen this game whatsoever had I known of its presence here, and that is RNG. Or, if you aren't familiar, randomness. This game unfortunately has some RNG elements that range from player manageable to having potential for mild time loss to this could end your run with a bad dice roll. And this is just me talking about the random elements that I'm personally aware of. There are some aspects I suspect might be RNG, but I haven't actually confirmed, namely some of the enemy placements and behavior from the action stages. Now, had this been a game that already had a more optimized record, and I mean no shade to Kefka when saying that, this RNG aspect might have been a deal breaker for me. But from some quick and dirty math, I was pretty sure that even with bad RNG, I'd still have potential to break the world record on a good run, and I hadn't even really encountered disastrous RNG yet, so I wasn't too demoralized. For the time being, I soldiered on and prayed to RNGesus for continued good luck. Examining this first run, a major pain point I identified came from the first round of the children's tournament in the last chapter. You see, the final chapter of this game revolves around this tournament and completing multiple rounds of challenges before progressing on to the final action stage. In a casual run, this made for an interesting hook and a nice change of pace for a chapter concept, and in my opinion, it's one of the more fun chapters for speedrunning as well. For the first round, you must head to Superman's tent, or formerly Superman's house, grab one of the letters lying on the ground, and return it to your teacher at school, who will then open the letter, read you a trivia question from within, and you have to answer it correctly. However, apparently many of these letters can just be outright duds, and if you bring one of these dud letters to your teacher, you'll have to start over again and grab a new letter. Now, this was a mechanic I was actually totally unaware of, as during my casual run, I apparently grabbed one of the correct letters on my first try. This time, however, it took me 3 tries before I grabbed a non-dud letter, with each failed attempt costing me about a minute of time loss. I researched this later and thankfully discovered this isn't actually RNG, and that there are certain letters that are guaranteed to not be a dud, which I took note of for later runs. Another major pain point came from these 2 sections that require you to find and knock out some wild boars, which the game will jokingly refer to as monsters. You have to check these bushes throughout the area to find 3 of them, but I hadn't made note of which bushes had the boars in them, and I also didn't know the best way to actually catch these critters, so I ended up losing a decent amount of time here as well. Otherwise, I knew the action stages were going to be a top priority for practice, as I was at least going to need some consistent strategies and execution for each to be able to get the world record. But before I get to practicing all of these things, I want to take a second and talk a bit more about the game itself, or specifically, our main playable character. Dr. Slump is a game loaded with charm and humor, and a lot of this really comes from our main protagonist, Arale. The game starts off with her Frankenstein-esque creation from Sinbei, who it's implied was trying to make a very different type of feminine robot, but we end up with Arale, whose main weakness is the fact that she's nearsighted and needs glasses. Even me, having a heart as cold as ice, I found it hard not to love Arale. Whether it be from her goofy animations, like this frog jump she learns, complete with an audible Kero Kero, her complete naivety when interacting with the townsfolk, her literal earth-shattering strength and physical resilience, or her plethora of catchphrases, Arale really is the star of the show. Although for that last point, they might be more of catch noises than catchphrases. Now, some of her personality is a bit tropish. There's definitely some punchlines and plot points that are treading old ground here, but I guess that's to be expected from a 1999 release that's based off a series from the 80s. And honestly, a lot of times that didn't even matter because the game often pulls the bit off anyway. And again, I need to give a big credit to HilltopWorks translation here because for an English playthrough, I definitely think a lesser or lazier translation could have had these gags bombed completely if not end up entirely lost in translation. One last fun little bit I'll mention is how some of Aralé's moveset feels like it mirrors that of Mario's in Mario 64. While not to say this was meant to copy Mario or that she doesn't have her own unique abilities, her long jump, ground pound, and even tiptoe animation gave me some minor deja vu while playing. Unfortunately, there aren't any backwards long jump strategies to be found here, at least not yet. So, back to the run, I now had my first attempt down, and I knew I needed to cut off around 21 minutes of time if I wanted a chance of breaking the world record. I had a good idea of what parts needed work, but didn't necessarily know the strategies that I'd yet want to practice. So, I decided it was time to give a detailed watch through of our current record holder's run and see what strategies I might could glean. More importantly, I also wanted to see if I could find any areas where he may have tripped up or faltered during his run that I could capitalize on to save time. After all, my goal wasn't to just match Kefka's time, it was to beat it. And I did learn quite a bit from his run. Kefka was using what seemed like optimal strategies for each of the action stages, which made a lot of sense considering he also had the world record for the separate category of all action stages. From watching his gameplay, I quickly discovered what looked to be my critical path to success for beating his time, which requires just a bit of context. So normally, when you die during an action stage, you'll continue back at the start of the section you were just in. Obviously, you want to try to avoid dying altogether if you want to get a good time, but in many areas you could probably manage a death or two and still have potential to break the current record. However, the third action stage is particularly unforgiving for deaths. Rather than starting you back at the same section, it has a habit of sending you back multiple sections to a set checkpoint, meaning a single death that might cost you 20 seconds of time on another stage could easily cost you over a minute here. This was something I'd been annoyed with during my casual run, considering the area has a lot of potential for instant death, but came to realize just how disastrous this could be while watching Kefka's run.
Why did I do that? Why did I do that? Why didn't I sprint? God, dude. I just can't get through this chapter, dude. I cannot get through this chapter. This one chapter makes me dislike this run infinitely more. Like, this one chapter is just so bad. It's so long, and it ends with this terrible area. Dude, we were gonna be like 4 minutes ahead of my PB if I had just gotten through that. Like, no joke. Like, for a game that's, like, not even that hard, this is, like, the most shockingly unlenient thing I've ever seen in a game. It's ridiculous.
This death was brutal, and from my estimation, cost him about a full minute and a half's worth of time, which, while I did feel bad for him, I knew this gave me a nice opportunity to capitalize on. Rather than trying to blitz through the third action stage as quickly as possible, I instead practiced with the goal of maximizing consistency and finding reliable strategies that would ensure I would not die here. I knew that saving a few seconds of time on this stage was unlikely to get me the world record, but knew that even one death here could cost me it entirely. Now, thankfully during my first run, I was also regularly capturing save states for notable areas I might want to practice later, which I was comfortable doing as I knew this run wouldn't be submitted and it had absolutely no chance of breaking the world record anyway. This ended up being pretty useful and it made it much easier for me to get access to each stage later for practice. There were two other action stages I spent some time practicing. The first was the beginning half of Action Stage 6, where you travel to an alien planet and have to collect 10 poos off these cliff sides as quickly as possible, and I realized in my last attempt that I really hadn't felt very comfortable in doing this. While it's pretty difficult to actually die in this area, it is an area you'll want to have some dedicated routing for, because A, falling off the cliffside for any reason will set you back a good amount, and B, many of these poos will travel to a new location once you're in proximity to them, and you need to be ready to grab them at their new location, else you run the risk of them traveling back to that original location, costing you even more time. Now, I had no interest in reinventing the wheel here, so I spent maybe half an hour trying to learn the route that Kefka used during his run, while modifying it just slightly to my own taste to try and make sure it was consistent for the little amount of practice I'd put in. By the end of this practice, I wasn't consistent enough to nail the route every time, but I did feel comfortable in getting close enough, and had enough knowledge now to know how to recover from any errors without it being too disastrous. The last section I focused on was Action Stage 1, which was mostly straightforward and just required a little bit of practice for the routing. For this stage, you're transported back to a prehistoric era and have to collect 9 dinosaur eggs before you can advance. It thankfully isn't a very difficult route to learn or to execute, with the major pain points coming from these 2 slippery guys you'll need to hit to grab their eggs. The first one is pretty simple, but the second one can have his position slightly changed each time you approach, which is made trickier from the lack of camera control. And if you miss this initial slide tackle onto him, you may lose anywhere from 5 to 15 seconds trying to hunt his goofy ass back down. But overall, the stage isn't too bad, and there's not much room for disastrous error. One minor thing I did notice during Kefka's run was his strategy in this boulder throwing minigame, where you have to destroy the statue on the left as quickly as possible by chunking these giant rocks at it. While his strategy seemed to be to stand at the top boulder and repeatedly throw it as it spawned, it seemed fairly clear to me that you could save time by running back and forth between the spawning boulders and minimize the downtime in waiting for respawns. I'm not sure if there was some element of randomness here that maybe his strategy helped alleviate, but I was finding a nice time save from doing it my way, which I felt would help give me another small edge during my attempts. Finally, while I didn't actually practice this part due to accidentally overwriting my save state, I did review Kefka's routing for Action Stage 5. There were a few things he'd figured out that I hadn't, like how to skip through most of the second section and a more minor skip during the final stretch, but they didn't seem too difficult at a glance, and I figured I'd just give them a try in a live run and maybe grab a save state to practice for next time. By now, I was feeling pretty good about my practice and decided it was time for another attempt to see how the run was shaping up and what gaps there still might be to fill. I did make a small personal optimization by copying over the guide I'd been following from speedrun.com to a local file so that I could make my own personalized edits to it. While the guide was great and accurate, there were some minor details I wanted to add that would hopefully make some sections more clear to me when reading in the heat of the moment. Namely, I jotted down which bushes I needed to check and their order during the 2 boar squashing sections, and I made a note for a section early on where you have to show Sinbei what moves you've learned, just to remind my dumb self what to actually do here. But before we move on to the second run, there's one more thing I should really touch on about this game, and it's something I probably should have already done more of by now, which is gushing over this game's visuals. Now this might sound excessive, but I would honestly describe this game's visual style as timeless. It's aged wonderfully and looks fantastic when upscaled, even if I did keep my own settings pretty mild during my playthroughs. It's the same sort of style and aesthetic that we know games like Mega Man Legends for, where the models themselves are mostly simple, with most of the detail and shading being baked beautifully into the textures. It's as close to a cartoon as a PlayStation game can look, and it's a unique style I really feel the world could still use more of. I also feel it's probably the main selling point of the game, as I don't think most other aspects reach quite the same heights. However, there are some other interesting choices that were made in terms of presentation. One feature I haven't yet discussed is this meter in the top left that fills when a Raleigh does something good or just finds a poo, called her pep gauge. When the gauge fills, you can meet with Sinbei and he'll unlock a new invention for you, which can manifest in a variety of ways. Most of the time, it'll give you the option of adding a useless but kind of funny HUD element, like a sound gauge or an altimeter for if you're concerned about your current height, or for if you really just want to cover your HUD in some random bullshit. Sometimes, these inventions will unlock new outfits like this absolutely incredible Michael Jordan basketball jersey. It's a fun little feature that I did appreciate because even though none of these unlockables really affected the gameplay, I still found myself looking forward to whatever random nonsense I was about to gain access to. That being said, I don't think I actually unlocked every invention available, which might be something worth going out of my way to do. I'll also go ahead and briefly touch on the game's music, which gets a solid thumbs up for me. It was all totally appropriate and suitable, with some legitimately catchy and lighthearted tunes that ended up stuck in my head for days after finishing. Some tunes you'll be hearing more than others, like this general town theme, Some you'll hear less often, like this almost tropical theme from one of the action stages. But I think my favorite track was actually Sinbei's lab theme, which I wish I had gotten to hear a bit more of. Otherwise, I wouldn't say there are any major standout tracks, and I don't think there's much here I'd listen to in my free time, but as a whole, I think Bandai did a great job with the soundtrack and in making sure that it all fit the vibe they were going for. It's a solid thumbs up, no complaints from me here. For my second attempt, I still had no expectations of actually grabbing the world record, but I did think I had the potential to get pretty close, so I locked in and really gave my best effort for the run. The focus and the practice both paid off here, and my second attempt ended with a time of 1 hour, 50 minutes, and 5 seconds. This had been a full 17 minutes faster than my first run, and now I was only about 3 minutes off from the world record. Almost everything had been improved on throughout the run. Action Stage 1 went smoothly, the poo collecting in Action Stage 6 still had some errors but was overall faster. I had a minor careless death in both Action Stages 5 and 7, each being around a 10 to 15 second time loss, but otherwise cleared both areas faster through some better routing. The bores were cleared much faster in both sections, but still had some room for improvement. But most importantly, my practice paid off in Action Stage 3, and I was able to clear the stage at a quick pace and crucially without any deaths. In general, things just moved along cleaner and quicker, and I was gaining valuable experience with the run. However, there were still some areas I had floundered in a bit and knew would need some more polish. Cleaning up the two previously mentioned action stage deaths would save me about 20 to 25 seconds on their own, and at least another 10 seconds could be saved from taking care of the bores faster. I also had an unexpected roadblock in Chapter 4 during a quiz game section that cost me a good chunk of time. You see, Chapter 4 is a little different in that you spend the chapter competing in various challenges against Obacha-man in lieu of having to complete an action stage in order to prove to him that you aren't actually a robot in pursuit of world domination. The first of these challenges is a quiz game with a minor twist. Your big-headed teacher will ask you a multiple-choice question, and you'll need to hit the box assigned the correct answer while also avoiding some minor obstacles. The questions he asks you are random, but the speedrun.com guide seemed to have all of the answers documented, or so I thought. The first question he asked, I both didn't know the answer to and couldn't seem to find on the guide, so I tried to guess, and I got it wrong. This was a time loss, but I figured I'd just pick it back up for the next two questions. However, the next question he asked also wasn't in the guide, and I shit the bed yet again because I got that one wrong too. Getting two wrong answers ends the minigame, and you have to start all over, which meant for me losing out on about 35 seconds. Another big time loss I hadn't been aware of came from my own incorrect routing. There's a part in Chapter 2 where you have to visit your teacher, Miss Midori, in her apartment to progress through the game, or so I thought anyway. In reality, for the second visit to the apartments, you actually only need to visit the apartment area in general and can immediately leave to keep things going. I had been costing myself an estimated 15 seconds or so from this alone, which would make for a very easy time save. And to be clear, the guide had said this, I was just misunderstanding what it was saying and really just inflicted this upon myself. I also apparently didn't learn my lesson in grabbing the envelope at Superman's tent in the final chapter, as I once again grabbed the wrong letter, which cost me about a minute. However, the biggest time loss of this run came from a section I really had just neglected to practice, which is Action Stage 2. This stage starts you off with a short area where you can perform a fun little cliffside skip before advancing through a series of 3 mazes to reach the boss. I think it was maybe an unwillingness from me to try and learn these maze routes, but I realized during this attempt just how unprepared I really was. In my casual run and first speedrun attempt, I guess I had kinda just messed around until I found my way through these mazes, but that obviously wasn't going to work anymore. From some rough estimating, I figured I had lost almost a full minute and 30 seconds during this section, and also realized I could probably clear the boss about 8 seconds faster with some improved strategy. Both of these should be pretty easy adjustments with just a bit of practice and memorization. All in all, from looking at what I considered to be major time losses, I identified about 4 minutes and 51 seconds worth of reasonable time saves to still be made, excluding general minor optimization and speediness. Of this, I only needed to shave off about 2 minutes and 59 seconds to nab the world record. However, this wouldn't be as simple as it sounded, as this all assumes that I wouldn't regress in any way from the previous run, and wouldn't incur any other sort of time loss that I hadn't expected. Still, at this point, I knew the record was well within my reach. However, while I was still enjoying the game and the sense of personal progression I was getting from improving my strategies and time, at this point some of the flaws I touched on during the casual run were really starting to become amplified. As mentioned before, the game's pace can be a bit sluggish, and there's a lot of dialogue you need to get through. Even with the speedrun routing cutting out literally all of the possible fat in terms of dialogue and interactions, it's still something like a 4-to-1 ratio of running around town talking to people versus doing action stage gameplay. But this is all made even worse when considering you still really need to stay locked in the entire time, and that's for a couple of reasons. The first is that you sort of need to have a good feel for when dialogue is going to be ending so that you're ready to keep moving immediately afterwards. From what I gathered, you have two options for advancing through dialogue. You can use the square button, or you can use the circle button. If you opt to mash the square button, but mash a little after the dialogue is ended, you'll end up inputting a punch, which, while pretty fast, will lock you in place for a short moment and cost you some time that could have been spent moving on to the next area. If you use circle, you'll end up in a similar situation, but with inputting a brief crouch rather than a punch, which is faster but still results in a very minor time loss. While using circle clearly seemed like the preferred option, neither option is great, and over time, both can result in seconds of time lost throughout the run, which you really want to try and minimize. Next is the actual act of mashing through dialogue. Your mileage certainly may vary here, but as someone who's had minor but chronic wrist pain over the years, this non-stop button mashing was absolutely not doing me any favors. For longer dialogue sections, I often opted to two-hand the face buttons and alternate mashing between square and circle, but overall, I genuinely was feeling the impact of the dialogue by the time I finished a run. And finally, there's the game's navigation system, which is a little unorthodox. Rather than having something like a map screen, the game opts instead for navigating via these signposts that use a sort of branching flowchart system. You can think of each area in the game as belonging to a sort of hidden internal hub, and areas in that hub are only accessible to other areas in that same hub. So as an example, if you're at the barber shop, you'll have access to your home, the school, and the coffee pot. But if you want to go to, say, the cinema, you'll first need to go home, because home will have the police station as part of its hub. Then you go to the police station because the cinema is part of the police station's hub, and then finally you can go to the cinema. It's a little hard to explain, but in practice this means that you frequently end up having to make intermediary stops at unrelated areas to get to where you're actually trying to go. In a casual run, this can definitely be pretty annoying, as the game frequently doesn't tell you where your next destination might be, oftentimes only implying or hinting at it, but when speedrunning, it just purely slows you down and makes you have to interact with more menu selections than you'd like. It also has compounding effects with some of the game's RNG elements, which can require you to check various areas across the game, and can also punish missteps in navigation even harder in terms of time loss. This system certainly isn't a deal breaker or anything, but it is sort of baffling, and I think it's the biggest head scratcher in terms of the game's design. I suspect the logic here was to try and help control the flow of plot progression to sort of make sure the player ends up going to certain areas at the right times instead of being able to go just anywhere, but even rationalizing it in that way, it just doesn't seem very good, and I really wish they had landed on a different system here. Now, back to the run. From here I got back to practicing. At this point, I had realized that you could actually just load any action stage on a completed save file, which made getting attempts in significantly easier without having to finagle with save states. When practicing, I made particularly sure I had a reliable and memorized route for Action Stage 2, although I was a bit lazy and didn't copy Kefka's fully optimized route. My logic was I only needed to beat his time, and I wasn't going to let perfect be the enemy of good here. I was trying to focus on the things that would give me the most value in terms of time saving, and in a run that was as admittedly unoptimized as this one, I knew I could get away with strategies that were less than perfect. I followed a similar line of reasoning with the final action stage, using a route I was comfortable with but maybe wasn't optimal. However, I did stop being lazy and looked up which letters at Superman's house I could rely on to not be a dud, which, if done right, should save me at least a minute of time. At this point, I knew the world record was obtainable, and I was ready to try to break the record in earnest. This might sound bad, but if I'm being honest, I really wanted this to be over with as soon as possible. I really wasn't born with that speedrunning gene. I'm a pretty competitive person and do enjoy gaining some level of mastery over the games I play, but I normally can't just play the same game over and over again and still enjoy it. I also knew that the longer these attempts went on, the harder I was going to find it to maintain focus, meaning that the odds of me losing out on the record from choking or from general carelessness would only increase as time went on. At this point, it was late, and with all of this in mind, I decided I'd need to get a good night's sleep so I could give this my all in the morning. So, after an okay night's sleep and now feeling a bit refreshed, I tried for a third run. This run started off well. After Chapter 1, I had already saved 27 seconds, which was unexpected, and honestly, I didn't review this gameplay enough to know what exactly to attribute that time save to. I did start to incorporate a strategy I saw Kefka using before gaining the dash ability, which is to just jump everywhere. I assumed that this was slightly faster than walking, and although I hadn't tested for any time difference myself, I trusted his method and I fell in line and just started jumping places during the very early game. Chapter 2 also went pretty well. Although I was feeling a bit sloppy in general, I had managed to save an additional minute and 17 seconds during the chapter, which I imagine was saved entirely during the action stage. I was now a minute and 45 seconds faster than my previous run. Assuming this pace continued, I'd only need to save a little over another minute, which was feeling entirely doable. Chapter 3's action stage naturally had me a bit stressed, as I knew a death would likely be cause for a reset, but thankfully I made it through without incident and even managed to clear the boss a bit faster than normal. I was now 2 minutes and 16 seconds faster than the last run. Things looked good. Chapter 4 was clean and simple, and from not messing up on the quiz game, I was now 3 minutes and 25 seconds ahead of my last run and officially on world record pace. Now, I'll be honest in saying that at this point, nerves were beginning to kick in a bit, and I was starting to remember an unfortunate fact about myself. At times, I can definitely be a bit of a choker. Pause. While the stakes here really weren't that high, I mean, it's just some Japanese PlayStation game with one other guy as my competition, I did have to make an effort to keep myself locked in here. And Chapter 5 is where things began to go a bit awry, and I ran into a roadblock that, to this point, I hadn't really thought much of. Most of the 5th chapter revolves around this weird side plot where you have to sell scrubbing brushes for these aliens in an attempt to raise money to buy a new spaceship home. It sounds ridiculous, and it is. That's kind of this game's whole MO. You have to sell 12 of these brushes in a somewhat involved series of tasks that really need to be completed in the right order to save the most amount of time. Thankfully, the guide has that all pretty well figured out, though I was often paranoid that I might miss a step by mistake and then have to try and course correct while frantically losing more time. Luckily, that wasn't what happened here. My troubles were with one of the particular tasks that you have to do to get the police chief to buy one of your brushes. The chief tasks you with finding a burglar who's roaming around town and with bringing him back to the station, which sounds easy enough, and really it is. The problem is that the location of this burglar is completely RNG, and he can appear in something like 12 different locations. This means that you essentially need to check every location for this little bastard, and every time you've guessed wrong as to where he is, you're probably losing out on between 8 to 10 seconds. This was made worse by the fact that I wasn't actually sure where in each area he could spawn. I assumed it would be somewhere obvious, but because I just didn't know, I also didn't want to risk visiting the area he's in and just not noticing him entirely, meaning I was wasting even more time than was probably necessary just to be sure I'd find him. In all of my other attempts, he had always appeared at the first area I checked, or at least within the first 2 or 3, so the possibility of this going awry really hadn't even entered my mind. It also didn't help that in Kefka's world record run, the burglar appeared in the very first location, aka with the best possible RNG.
Okay, hey buddy, how you doing? Hi there, buddy boo.
This was all a combination of bad RNG and a lack of preparation for me, and I was beginning to think this run was probably dead. Eventually I did find him, but it was after checking something like 9 locations, which is some of the worst RNG possible. By the time I finished the stage, I was down 1 minute and 20 seconds from where I was, which still had me at 2 minutes and 5 seconds of overall time saves, but that wasn't going to be enough to grab the world record. Still, I powered on, and for Chapter 6, the main focus was going to be on the action stage. During the Poo Collection mission, I did okay, but still not as well as I could have, and lost out on a good amount of potential time savings. I also cleared the boss a bit slower than I had before, but overall I managed to save an additional 8 seconds during the chapter. It was coming down to the wire for this run, and I'd have to save nearly 50 seconds in this last chapter to break the record, which was possible, but was a position I had really not wanted to find myself in. In the first competition trial, I finally managed to grab the correct letter, and then the rest of the trials went pretty smoothly. I was doing pretty well on time going into the final action stage, and really just needed to not mess up at this point to break the world record. And honestly, things went pretty much according to plan in that regard. The performance was totally par, with a special note here that I did not die on this attempt as I had previously. Finally, there was only the final boss left. I just needed to not choke this, and the record would be as good as mine. I was nervous, but determined. But then, the unthinkable happened. The boss started to use a move I'd somehow never even seen before, and I was starting to see this run dissipate before my very eyes. I was caught completely off guard and wasn't even sure how you were meant to handle this attack, and... oh, well that actually didn't really do much of anything. So anyway, a short while later, I had the boss beaten and called time just as the credits began to roll. Final time, 1 hour, 46 minutes, and 23 seconds. World record obtained, solidly beating the previous record of 1 hour, 47 minutes, and 8 seconds. A 45-second difference, and a time I honestly was pretty proud of. I don't think this is a record that will have much longevity to it, but even having this record for only a day would leave me feeling fulfilled. More importantly, I was relieved that I could now take a breath and relax, and no longer have to worry about getting this record to make sure that I don't look dumb over the internet. And while I'd worked on this run in complete silence besides telling some of my close friends about what I was doing, I was surprised to see the members of this tiny community reach out almost immediately after submitting my run to congratulate me. It was honestly pretty dope and was really nice, and was not at all the experience I'd had with some other game. In fact, I ended up chatting with some of these folks later, and besides them all being super nice, I came to realize just what a group effort it had been in routing this game and the level of work they had really put in. And I guess I should have expected that. As they say, it takes a village to run a slump, or something like that. So, with the goal I set out for having been accomplished and feeling pretty good about myself, let's come down a bit here and try to put a bow on all of this. Taking a look back at Dr. Slump in the way that most people would experience it as a casual playthrough, the game is solid, if maybe a bit of a novelty in some ways. Looking at the total package, the gameplay is definitely more of an afterthought, but the overall presentation, eye candy, dialogue, and general charm will, I think, really carry this game for a lot of people. Some of the enjoyment may hinge on your tolerance for classic anime-style humor, and your mileage may vary in that regard, but there's definitely no lack of personality here, even if things can be a bit tropey at times. The game is undoubtedly a visual treat, however, and I'd personally rank its visuals amongst some of the console's best. I don't think this is a game for everyone, and honestly, it isn't the type of game I'd normally have found myself playing, but if the concept of a playable comedy anime appeals to you, then this might be one of the best options out there. But if you're looking for more fulfilling gameplay systems, or a stable frame rate, then you may find Dr. Slump a little lacking. As a speed game, it's a bit of a mixed bag, at least if we're discussing the any percent category. I genuinely had fun learning and running this game, and while I don't want to discourage anyone from trying it, there are some aspects that I feel can't be ignored. With the vast majority of the gameplay consisting of running around and mashing through dialogue, the skill expression and player agency in this category is almost certainly lower than its 3D platformer contemporaries. The action stages do provide some fun and more skill-intensive sections, but unfortunately are few and far between, and will often have their minuscule time saves totally dwarfed by the pure RNG that can be found in other parts of the run. However, I do imagine this would be a more rewarding speed game when doing the all action stages category, and had I known what I know now, I may have just tried for that record instead. It seems like that's a category that really gets to the meat of the game and also just doesn't take as long to finish an attempt. All this being said, I did genuinely have a lot of fun practicing the game and working towards the world record, but I also think that had these runs continued on much longer, I might have gotten a bit tired by the 6th or 7th attempt. Now, for those of you that have been paying attention to this point, you may have had a thought to the effect of, wait, this still seems like a pretty beatable run. And for that, you'd be right, because there's still plenty of room for improvement here. And so, I'm throwing down the gauntlet. If any of you fine viewers want to try to capture this record for yourself, give it a shot. It'd be awesome to see this tiny community get some activity, and besides, I've already had my dopamine hit from getting the record, it's somebody else's turn. If anyone does manage to smash this record in the next month or two, hit me up and I'll be sure to give you a nice shout out in a future video. And to be clear here, that includes the man himself as well. Which, speaking of, I do want to give a quick shout out to Kefka14 and the other folks involved in this tiny little speedrunning community that helped put this routing guide together. This all would have been a lot less approachable without the legwork they'd already put in, so feel free to show these folks some love on their respective channels down in the description. Anyway, I want to thank all of you again for watching. I've had a lot of fun making these videos so far, and if you've watched some of my previous stuff, you'll know that this has been a bit of a departure from what I normally do. While I definitely still have some more traditional deep dives planned ahead, I'm also cooking up a few more experimental ideas like this for some future videos, though I'm probably going to be all speed ran out for a little while. But do you like this sort of content, or do you prefer more traditional analysis of these lesser known games? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'm genuinely curious how people feel about this. Otherwise, feel free to hit any combination of those buttons down below, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace!